Here's your paraphrased and expanded version, keeping the emotional depth, dramatic punctuation, and articulation intact while ensuring YouTube compliance. Music. Richard Kensington was never the type to be easily swayed by emotions. His heart had been hardened by experience, his mind sharpened by ambition. A self-made billionaire, he had constructed his empire from the ground up, earning every single penny with sheer determination, razor-sharp insight, and an unyielding drive for success. His name alone carried immense weight in boardrooms across the globe. When he spoke, people listened. His decisions? Always precise, always calculated. Many admired him, some even feared him, but none of that truly mattered to Richard. Because beneath all the power, all the wealth, and all the influence, there was only one thing that held meaning for him: his son, Dorian. From the moment Dorian entered this world, Richard had cherished him beyond words. His son was not just his pride and joy, but the very reason behind his relentless pursuit of success. Every late night, every high-stakes deal, every sacrifice, Richard did it all for Dorian. He ensured his son had access to the finest education, the best mentors, and limitless opportunities. He hadn't built this empire just for himself. No, he had built it for Dorian. One day, he expected his son to step up, take the reins, and continue the Kensington legacy. Dorian was meant to be the heir to everything Richard had worked for. But over time, things changed. Richard watched in silent anguish as his son became someone he could hardly recognize. The once humble, grateful young man had grown distant, cold, indifferent. The love and care Richard had poured into him met with apathy. The values of hard work, loyalty, and integrity Richard had tried so hard to instill, rejected. Dorian had become arrogant, entitled, as if the wealth and influence surrounding him were simply his birthright, something he never had to earn. Richard could barely believe it. His own son, the person he had dedicated his life to, was slipping away from him. And no matter what he did, he couldn't seem to reach him. One evening, as Richard sat alone in his grand study, gazing out the window at the city skyline, an unsettling thought took root in his mind. Had he failed? Had he, in his pursuit of building an empire, unintentionally destroyed the one thing that mattered most? Had his wealth corrupted his son? The more he thought about it, the heavier the weight on his chest became. He needed answers. And he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. Dorian had to be tested. But how? After hours of contemplation, Richard arrived at a shocking decision. He would vanish. Leave behind everything: his mansion, his fortune, his identity. He would strip away all the luxury, all the power, and live as an ordinary man. And then he would wait. Would Dorian even care? Would he come searching? Would he finally realize that his father was more than just a provider of wealth? There was only one way to find out. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Richard packed a single duffel bag, only the bare essentials. A small amount of cash, a few clothes. As he stood at the entrance of his estate, looking back at the empire he had built, a strange feeling washed over him. Clarity. For the first time in years, he felt certain this was something he had to do. And so, Richard Kensington disappeared. For weeks, he wandered the streets, leaving behind the world of opulence he once knew. His once impeccable suits? Now ragged. The polished shoes he had worn to high-profile meetings? Scuffed and unrecognizable. He slept in shelters, ate whatever scraps he could afford, and melted into the anonymity of the crowd. He was no longer the billionaire businessman, just another nameless face in the city. From a distance, he observed Dorian. His son showed no signs of concern, no indication that he had noticed his father's absence beyond the logistical inconveniences. Instead, Dorian continued his extravagant lifestyle, driving the most expensive cars, dining at the most exclusive restaurants, surrounding himself with people who only cared about status. Richard occasionally caught glimpses of him, either through the glass windows of luxurious penthouses or in whispered conversations about his latest exploits. It was clear that Dorian hadn't missed the wealth his father had provided. But had he missed him? Richard wasn't sure, and the uncertainty gnawed at his heart. One evening, Richard found himself standing outside a high-end restaurant, one of Dorian's favorite spots. Across the street, hidden in the shadows, he watched as his son stepped out of a sleek black car, laughing with colleagues, exuding the confidence of a man who had never known struggle. The sight sent a sharp pang through Richard's chest. This was his son, his blood. And yet, at that moment, he felt like a stranger to him. Summoning every ounce of courage, Richard made his way toward the restaurant. The moment he stepped inside, he was struck by how familiar everything felt: the elegant decor, the soft hum of conversations, the scent of fine cuisine. This had once been his world. And now he was an outsider. At the hostess stand, he cleared his throat. "A table for one, please," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions raging within him. The hostess barely spared him a glance. Her eyes flickered over his worn-out clothes, his unkempt appearance. Disdain curled on her lips as she responded coolly, "I'm sorry, sir. We don't have seating available for someone like you." Richard felt his stomach twist, but he didn't react. He had grown accustomed to this treatment over the past few weeks, but no matter how many times it happened, the sting never fully dulled. As he turned to leave, a painful thought crossed his mind. Had he truly become invisible? Not just to the world, but to his own son? To the sting of rejection, Richard swallowed his pride. His voice, usually commanding and strong, wavered slightly as he pleaded, "Please, it's been a long day." The hostess, however, remained unmoved. Her expression didn't soften, her posture didn't shift. To her, he was just another nameless, unimportant man. Realizing there was no point in arguing, Richard turned to leave. But as he did, his eyes landed on a familiar figure. There, sitting at a lavishly decorated table, surrounded by executives and so-called friends, was Dorian. He was laughing, carefree, completely unbothered by the world around him. A sharp pang of sadness gripped Richard's chest. Does he even realize I'm gone? Taking a deep breath, he stepped closer. His heart pounded. This was it, the moment of truth. Dorian? His voice, though steady, carried years of longing, disappointment, and hope. Dorian's head snapped up at the sound of his name. For a brief second, confusion flickered across his face. Then something colder, dismissive, indifferent. "Do I know you?" Dorian's tone was sharp, detached, like he was speaking to a stranger. Richard felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. "Do I know you?" The words echoed in his mind, cutting deeper than he thought possible. Steeling himself, he met his son's gaze. "It's me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your father." Dorian's eyes scanned Richard's weathered face. There was no flicker of recognition, no warmth, no concern. Without hesitation, he exhaled sharply and said, "I don't have time for this. Leave." The coldness in his voice shattered Richard. His worst fear had been confirmed. Dorian hadn't just failed his test, he had failed him as a son. Richard turned on his heel and walked away. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he did, he knew he'd break. The days that followed passed in a haze of silent contemplation. Richard had built an empire, had forged his name into history, had given everything to his son. And yet, none of it had mattered. Not where it truly counted. But now, it was time to act. Summoning his longtime lawyer, Marcus, Richard wasted no time. "Reduce Dorian's inheritance," he ordered, his voice like steel. "Leave him just enough to survive, but not thrive." Marcus hesitated. "Richard, are you sure about this?" "I've trusted you for years, Marcus," Richard said, meeting his gaze. "But this is necessary." Marcus sighed but nodded. "I'll take care of it." But Richard wasn't finished. He needed to know just how deep the betrayal ran. And so, he hired Olivia, a skilled private investigator, to uncover the truth. Days later, the findings landed on his desk. And what he saw shattered whatever fragile hope remained. Dorian wasn't just entitled, he was corrupt. He had engaged in shady deals, manipulated clients, betrayed loyal colleagues. He had used the Kensington name not as a legacy to uphold, but as a shield to hide behind while making ruthless, unethical decisions. Richard's heart ached. His own son, a man without integrity, without honor. He had to face him. One last time. The summons was simple. A message. A place. A time. When Dorian arrived at the mansion, the confidence that once defined him seemed dimmed. There was unease in his steps, uncertainty in his eyes. Richard sat at the long dining table, motioning for him to sit. The air was thick with unspoken words. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "You failed me." His voice, though steady, was laced with a deep, cutting pain. "I gave you everything, and you threw it all away." Dorian's jaw tightened. "I built my own success," he shot back. "I worked hard." No, Richard's voice was sharp. "You were handed everything. And instead of honoring it, you betrayed it. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed the values I raised you with." Slowly, Richard slid a folder across the table. Dorian hesitated before opening it. As his eyes scanned the legal documents, his face paled. His hands trembled slightly. This can't be real." His voice cracked. "You can't do this. I already have." Richard's voice, though resolute, held a trace of sorrow. "This is the last lesson I will ever teach you," he exhaled. "From here on out, you build your own life. No more safety nets. No more shortcuts." Dorian's face twisted with rage. He slammed the folder shut and pushed away from the table. "You'll regret this," he spat. Richard didn't flinch. "I regret nothing more than the man you've become." For a moment, Dorian just stood there, fists clenched, chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. And then he turned and stormed out. Richard didn't stop him. He didn't call after him. He simply closed his eyes, feeling the weight of finality settle over him. Months passed. Without his father's influence, Dorian's life unraveled. His ventures collapsed. His so-called friends? They vanished the moment his wealth ran dry. For the first time in his life, Dorian was truly, completely alone. And for the first time, he understood. One cold, rainy night, he stood outside the mansion gates, soaked to the bone, staring at the place he once called home. But this time, it wasn't the wealth he longed for. It wasn't the status. It was his father. The love. The guidance. The foundation he had taken for granted. But it was too late. With a heavy heart, Dorian turned away. The road ahead would be long, difficult, lonely. But for the first time in his life, he knew this was a path he had to walk alone.